Okay, we'll start. So Frank McNamara, VC, and the most famous incident in Australian Flying Corps history. Now, says who? Well, Michael Malkenton says that, so I'm happy to take Michael's judgment. Today, I'm going to say that this is probably an incident that most people have actually heard something about, but what have you heard? That the facts that are out there in all of the things that have been written about this incident in general don't agree with each other. And I'm hoping to take you down what I think is the most interesting compilation of what seems to be the right story. And we'll see how we go. I think it's a fascinating story. It's a one squadron AFC story, not three squadron. And I wrote this presentation originally in order to sing for my supper. I had a rather exclusive club ask me to do a presentation, and this was the topic they wanted, so I had a lot of fun researching it. Frank, of course, was the winner of the only Flying Corps Victoria Cross in the First World War. The only Australian, even the ones in the RFC, and there were a lot in the RFC as well, and the RAF. He was the only Australian in any of the flying services to win a Victoria Cross. I have visited Frank's original hometown, which is Rushworth in Victoria. It's a lovely old place. It had a spectacular history of a very big gold rush, which is where the name Rushworth comes from. And it's a delightful place to visit today. I'm sure that Frank would recognise the main street today. It's exactly like it was 100 years ago, except with electric vehicles instead of horses and carts. Frank was born into quite a large family in 1894 in this town. If the war had not arisen and the international tensions hadn't arisen, Frank would have been a country school teacher, quite possibly later a teacher, trainer, an academic. He was a good student and somebody who was due to go far from his small country town, but his interest was in education and he trained as a teacher, but there were storm clouds brewing on the horizon, and everyone in Australia was subjected to some form of militia training. So Frank, like many others, was a member of what was called the senior cadets at school. Then from the age of 18, he actually was in a reserve army group called the Brighton Rifles. At the same time, he was studying in Teachers College and also in Melbourne University for his higher education. When the war broke out in 1914, so Frank had basically been involved in part-time military organisations for some time, as had many Australian citizens at that time. Now, after the outbreak of war, there was more mobilisation. He was still part-time, but he spent some time at Fort Nepean, which is one of the headlands of Port Phillip Bay. And Fort Nepean is rather famous for firing the British Empire's first shot of World War I. Now, you've probably seen this photograph before, but I can tell you a little bit of research about the photograph, that this gun is actually the one that fired the first shot of the war, and the barrel of the gun was later changed, but then the same gun with a different barrel fired the first Australian shot of World War II as well. The first shot of World War I was to stop a German freighter which was trying to escape from Port Phillip Bay before the outbreak of the war, and it was stopped, and it was basically then confiscated by the Australian military forces and became an Australian transport ship. Frank also was involved in the Officer Training School at Broadmeadows. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yes, excuse me, Paul. We've got two arrangements here for showing the slides to the local people, which is different from the one online. So I'll think of a signal for Paul. I'll switch over. Yes, he also spent time at Broadmeadows, which was an officers' training school, and I think that Frank's existing skills in education actually shaped his career in the military as well, because he was promoted and utilised as an educator in doing training. He was an instructor in February to May 1915, and at the same time he was also going out and working as a civilian relief teacher, because lots of teachers in the Victorian school system were signing up and Frank was replacing them. Now this other picture is showing Frank at Broadmeadows Camp. This was one of the very large collection of Australian soldiers' photographs that were made at that time. Now, he joined the Flying Corps in August of 1915, and he qualified at Point Cook for his wings. You can see on this page the application form for Frank, but actually this is in the handwriting of Dickie Williams, that he made a certified true copy of the application, and so you've got two for the price of one. There's Frank's details and Dickie Williams' autograph here. But anyway, he became the adjutant of 1st Squadron AFC, and they shipped out to Egypt in March 1916. He was very, as were all the Australians, very rudimentary training happening in Australia at that time. So they were completely unsuited for combat flying. And so they had to be trained further. Some were trained in Egypt. Frank was actually sent to England. So he went to the Central Flying School in Upavon, which I believe still exists. In August, he went back to Egypt, that's August of 1916, as an instructor in number 22 Squadron RFC. So yet again, his teacher's skills are being utilised. And then on 21st of October 1916, I presume after he'd actually had quite a bit more flying experience as an instructor, then he went into combat duty with 1st AFC. And swapping the slide. So the 1st Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps was involved in this battle, which was occurring in the desert in between Egypt and Palestine. So Palestine is quite green. It was always called the Fertile Crescent. It's one of the cradles of civilization. But the Sinai Desert is a serious dry desert. And you can see in this photograph that's a 1 AFC, I think a BE-2, but only with a pilot on board, flying over the point where the Nile Delta turns into a sandy wasteland. And the way that you move a modern army across this sandy wasteland is by building logistics, including a desert railway and also a water pipeline. They were absolutely essential to putting large numbers of men up into the desert to besiege the Ottoman Turks in Palestine. And the photo on the bottom right here, you can see, is actually a hospital train, again using the brand new desert railway. I think that these chaps are Australians. This is the Camel Corps, carrying litters with the wounded people on them, and this is the sort of conditions that wounded people had to put up with in the desert. The hospital train will reappear in Frank's story as well. Now, the 1st Squadron AFC, changing the slide, that photograph on the top left is remarkable. In fact, 1st Squadron is a remarkable organisation for the number of famous people that came out of it. The 6 men in this picture, there's a Victoria Cross, there's 2 people who later became knights, and they weren't the only ones in 1st Squadron AFC. There's a chap killed in a flying accident, and a chap shot down who was prisoner, and another one who got shell shock and was sent back to Australia. And so it's all action in this unit. It was a crucible of many people who had a very important part to play in the Royal Australian Air Force in later years, all came through this organisation. And I've also got a colour view of Frank's Martenside. Now, this is based on somebody else's artistic research, and this colour profile looks too magnificent to me. It doesn't look as knocked around as the 1 AFC aircraft generally were, but anyway, that's what the Martenside elephant looked like, and what it doesn't show is the bomb racks which were rigged up underneath, which I've got a picture of later. Now, the role of the squadron at this stage in the war, that just like there was a desert railway supporting the British forces, the Ottomans had an existing railway which was critical to their logistics for their front line. And bombing the Ottoman railways was an important task for 1AFC. Now, they also did reconnaissance photography, which was a rapidly developing art. And they were also supporting the ground troops with often close support and doing artillery spotting, guiding the artillery onto targets on the front line. Amongst all of this activity, planes were being shot down or suffering from mechanical failures. And in March of 1917, just in this month, they started doing rescues of people. It so happened that right at this time, 3 different rescues had already happened before the 19th of March. The first one was a force-landed pilot, Tunbridge. He was walking back through the desert and he was rescued in a BE-2 by Snell and Morgan. The second incident, a chap called Heathcote landed with engine failure. Snell again was a potential rescuer but couldn't find the landing place, and Heathcote was captured. And then on the 19th of March, a person we all know, Ross Smith, who was an observer at that time, and Beaulieu, they picked up, I didn't note the name of the people rescued, but they were RFC men, and both rescuers in that case on the 19th of March were awarded the Military Cross for their actions. And they had a bit of a gunfight with the Turks on the ground as well.
James, if I ask you, was Tunbridge, where did they carry Tunbridge when they brought him back? Because there's already 2 of them flying.
He's standing on the wing and is laying over the top of the midsection of the aircraft and hanging on for dear life. But he would have been wearing a flying coat anyway, so that would have helped.
Yes.
Yes, so this figures in Frank's story as well. Now, we come then to the 20th of March, the following day, and the mission of number 1 Australian Flying Corps on that day, would you believe, was bombing Gaza. A very topical subject. Now, and in fact, this photograph that I have is the Israelis bombing Gaza exactly 100 years after Frank McNamara's mission. Now, Frank was not bombing a city. The countryside you can see on this slide is actually where Frank ended up landing, and the target of their bombing mission was basically the railway line running north from this point. There's a modern day railway bridge still there today, but there used to be a railway bridge going across the Wadi, or the little valley that was there. These days there's a freeway running through the same area. And you can actually see the railway running off on the right-hand side of the photograph as well. Now you'll note that the landscape is not sandy desert. We've moved into the Fertile Crescent, and this is much the same time of year actually, this photograph. So you would have had a grassy landscape, but potentially not a wonderful place to land an aircraft, but not a sandy desert. Now, what we also have is, thanks to some research that was, I think, done for Cross and Cockade magazine originally, is Frank's own logbook. So these are his own words that he wrote in his logbook. And he talks about 2 BE-2s and 2 Martinsides flying off, each of them taking 6 howitzer shells. So not bombs, they were short of bombs. And I believe Wackett may have become involved in rigging up the mechanism to drop these howitzer shells, but anyway, they had jury-rigged howitzer shells. I think they have a 40-second time fuse on them. And I flick to the next slide, and here is the War Memorial's picture of 3 of these shells mounted on one wing of a Martinside Elephant. There were 3 on the other side, so 6 in total. And the pilot basically would release the shell, and I think that would then just pull a string that was attached to the timing fuse, and you've got 40 seconds and the bomb will go off. Now, so Frank wrote in his logbook, the shells had a delayed action of 40 seconds. he wrote that he followed Ellis in their bombing run, and then a train turned up on the track. Now, other records say that it was a Turkish rail maintenance train, so let's assume that it was. But in any case, it was an attractive target to try and bomb the train. They were bombing a section of track that was fairly vulnerable because curved track on an embankment is hard to replace. But as Frank goes in to drop his number 5 shell, it exploded just after it had fallen off his aircraft. And he wrote in his logbook, "wounding me in the right buttock." So the explosion came through his seat and drove a lot of fragments of the seat into the bottom of his thigh. And he actually wrote, Mark Lax very kindly sent me a photograph of a letter that Frank wrote to his mother. And in the letter, he puts a bit more detail. He said he felt the most incredible burning feeling in his thigh, and he managed to tie his scarf, his aviator's scarf, over the wound. So this would have helped to staunch it was quite a serious wound. He said the wings were ripped about, but the engine unhurt. He dropped 2 smoke bombs, so that was a signal for the other machines that he was going home, and he started off home. And when I flick to the next slide, we see that he didn't get far before he saw down below Rutherford, another of the pilots, who was in a BE-2C but flying it alone, was on the ground, again with distress smoke out, and the Turkish cavalry were approaching. And again, the letter to Frank's mother says that Rutherford was frantically tinkering with his engine while being shot at. We couldn't have helped his concentration. So Frank says he landed and taxied up to Rutherford, who was trying to burn his machine. Now, very fortunately, he didn't succeed in getting it burning. Frank yelled for Rutherford to hurry, but Frank's in a single-seat aircraft, so Rutherford climbed up onto the engine cowl, so laying across this over the top. So then Frank opened up the engine. The trouble was, you had an aircraft which had got shredded wings from the shrapnel explosion, an extra body standing on board, at least one asymmetric shell hanging off one wing, and the pilot has got a large bite taken out of his thigh and is bleeding through his scarf and is depending on his right leg to keep the plane straight. So sadly, the expected happened and the plane swung around. They had a relatively low speed crash. He says about 35 miles per hour, and it smashed up the machine, but both Rutherford and Frank McNamara were otherwise unhurt and could extract themselves from the wreckage with Turkish rifle fire still coming in. So Frank thought he'd destroy his plane, so he fired a bullet into the petrol tank and then put a very flare pistol, which blew it up. Then he's saying rifle fire from the Turks started to Rutherford's BE, which was not on fire yet. Now, at about 200 metres they had to go. In landing, Rutherford had ripped off a tyre, broken centre section wires, cracked a longeron, and dropped a Lewis drum under a rudder bar. So right at this moment, when they're running under fire to the other plane, the remaining shell on board Frank's plane explodes in the fire. So that goes kaboom. It would have made an excellent movie, this, blowing the Martinsyde to pieces. Then we go on to the 4th page of Frank's logbook. Frank is saying, leg pretty dud, bullets whizzing about. What he wrote to his mother was, hobbled back as fast as my leg would allow. Turks on their horses coming down through a clearing and bullets thudding in the sand behind us. They reached Rutherford's machine. Now, Frank sat in the pilot's seat, but as you know, to start a machine of that era, you need someone to swing the prop and someone to do the contact switch. And Rutherford couldn't have done it by himself. Now, anyway, Rutherford gave the prop a swing, contact, and she started. So what a relief. So Frank swung the machine around to take off. He opened up the throttle. He said, and again to the mother, he says, Rutherford, still climbing aboard, firing his service revolver at the Turks. So this is like a scene out of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now the machine stuck 3 times on the soft ground and then lifted off, just in time to escape the rush of the Turks. Now the artwork below here is by Septimus Power. It was painted without consultation with Frank, and it was painted a couple of years after the war ended. But it shows the BE2 getting away from the Turks. Apparently Frank had many criticisms of this painting, and I can tell you some of them I can guess at. There's no... I think there should be about 3 bombs hanging underneath this plane, for one. Frank's wearing his scarf, it's not wrapped around his leg. The Turks are in a mounted group, and for reasons I'll explain shortly, they would have been dismounted actually, and they were all around the plane, they weren't just in one group. And the landscape, as you saw, is more green and pleasant than this sort of biblical desert that's there. But anyway, that wasn't the end of the story though, so they got away from the Turks, but Frank now has to pilot this plane all the way back, an hour and 20 minutes to get back to their base. And he nearly fainted a few times, and he wrote in his logbook, "Put the wind up Rutherford." Well, I'm sure it would have, because if the pilot faints, then they're both dead. I think the BE2 did have some mechanism to attach a second, a little dummy steering column in the observer's cockpit, but it sounds like that wasn't available for whatever reason. And of course, it hadn't been flown as a 2-seat aircraft. You know, Rutherford was by himself when he took off. And he says then he landed all right with 3 bombs still in the rack, and he was evacuated by the hospital train, the same one we saw before, at 7:15 p.m, so in the evening. But he had a long, slow trip on the train to get back to the hospital at Kantara. Now, the next slide here, we've got a record written by Frank's doctor, Bill McDonald, and he wrote, the hospital train arrived at 5 in the morning, so it must have been a very long, painful trip for Frank on the hospital train. He said it was a huge, ugly wound, and Frank told him that it felt as if it had been hit with a sledgehammer, which I'm sure it did. The other description is that there was all sorts of debris in the wound, that it took quite a bit of cleaning up. On the flight back, McNamara nearly fainted several times, but recovered by pushing his head into the slipstream. And it would have been a smash and death for both if he'd fainted. So it was already a daring do story. So Dr. McDonald dressed the wound and had him x-rayed at 10 o'clock. At 11:30 a.m, they gave him a routine antitoxin tetanus shot. Now, what Bill wrote is 1 man in 1,000 has an idiosyncrasy. Frank passed out, went into a coma. He was absolutely blue and cold, no pulse, not breathing. So, a real medical emergency. And Bill gave him artificial respiration for half an hour before they got a breath out of him. And in those days, artificial respiration was much less effective than it is today. They didn't do the sort of mouth to mouth. They were thumping on his chest, moving his arms, and also they, in order to stop his circulation, like his skin dying, they always packed hot water bottles around the person getting this resuscitation. But the hot water bottles had not been properly insulated, and one of them burned about as big as a tennis ball, a big patch of flesh right off Frank's foot. So his bones were exposed, a very huge, raw, third-degree burn. However, Bill McDonald doesn't mention this in the letter to his father. He mainly mentions the fact that they saved Frank, and he said, "I was drenched with perspiration, had pains in my arms and legs when it was all over." But again, what a heroic story here. Now I've got another slide here about serendipity, that the only way that we, or history, knows about Bill McDonald's notes is because he wrote a letter to his father. That none of this is in Frank's official record, nothing about his medical treatment. And so, thankfully, Bill McDonald actually lived in Mossman, New South Wales. And so, although he was in the British RAMC, isn't it, Royal Army Medical Corps, that Bill came from Mossman. He was writing back to his dad in Mossman, and his dad basically sent the letter off to the Daily Telegraph because there was very little information in the papers about Frank McNamara's VC. It was famous, but the actual official citation was very short and vague. Anyway, the paper published it, and it went all around, it went from paper to paper, so this became, again, another big chunk of the story. And I have had contact with Frank McNamara's descendants, and they told me that Bill remained in touch with Frank and his family for the rest of their lives. And Frank basically thanked Bill very much for saving his life and realised the importance of what he'd done. However, on this slide also is another little notable patient of Dr. MacDonald was Ross Smith, later to become very famous as the main pilot on the first England to Australia flight. But at the time, just a chap who was flying a plane in one squadron, and he wasn't famous at the time, so I imagine Bill MacDonald might have written to his father about Ross Smith, but it certainly didn't get into the paper. The medical note for Ross is actually much better than the medical note for Frank, and it says, wounded in scalp and face and lost a tooth from German machine gun bullets in aerial combat. And you can see on his shorts here that it's spots of blood. So, but look at the smile on him, bulletproof. Yes. Now, Bill MacDonald carried on and saying at 7, Frank was eating a plate of chicken and drinking champagne. Now, the War Memorial's got several nice photographs of Frank in hospital. He was, I think he was the talk of the town when this incident happened. And Bill MacDonald wrote to his dad, if he doesn't get the VC, then something pretty good. Also in this photograph you can actually see the binding that's around his right foot. He was actually wounded in the right buttock, and then his right foot was badly burnt. And that wound of the foot remained with Frank for the rest of his life. It troubled him for a long time. And it affected his career as well. Now also, here's a deposition made by Rutherford, the man who was rescued. He talks about even if Frank had not been wounded, he would have been justified in not coming down because the Turks were all around. But the fact that he was already wounded makes this just outstanding gallantry. His determination and resource and utter disregard of danger throughout the operation is worthy of the highest praise. And a week later, Frank was indeed recommended for the Victoria Cross, and it was awarded. Now, Rutherford wrote this testimonial actually from a hospital bed because he himself had been shot down in the intervening week. I'd like to talk a little about the unsung rescuers here. That in the National Archives there are several papers supporting Frank's VC recommendation, and one of them comes from the General Officer Commanding Middle East Brigade of the Royal Flying Corps, who was Geoffrey Salmon, who was quite a significant figure in Australian aviation history himself. But there's important detail in that submission which is not in the other brief descriptions of the incident. One of which is that Frank could not stand up with his wound. So this means that Rutherford carried, like a three-legged race, being shot at by the Turks, carried Frank to back to the BE aircraft. So Rutherford rescued McNamara while McNamara was rescuing Rutherford. And Rutherford also had to put Frank into the cockpit. So Frank was incapable of climbing into the cockpit of the BE-2. Now, that's all very good, and they both survived, but then Rutherford went back into action, and he was shot down in aerial combat only a week later. He had 4 bullet wounds, and his observer, Hyam, was killed, who was the 1AFC's first battle casualty. And Rutherford, with all these experiences, was then sent to Australia for 3 months to have a rest, which he did. He came back, he was involved in training, and then he went back into action. Now, reading between the lines, I think Rutherford's got to have PTSD. But anyway, he went back into action. Flying a Bristol fighter, he was again shot down and landed successfully with his observer, but then they set the plane on fire, and another Bristol fighter crew came down to rescue them. So the idea was Rutherford could have been rescued for a second time, But according to the pilot of the other Bristol fighter, Rutherford was very, very shaky. He put his foot through the fabric of the wing, and when they started to take off, Rutherford started to fall off the wing. And the pilot of the Bristol fighter grabbed Rutherford, but in doing that, he then lost control of his own aircraft, and they spun out and crashed, and all four of them were captured by the actually Arabs, but then handed to the Turks. So Rutherford did indeed end the war in Turkish captivity. But nonetheless, he's another unsung rescuer from the original VC incident. And the other two people who really deserve praise are Ellis and Drummond, who were the other two pilots in the air on this bombing raid. They saw what was going on, and they held the Turks off with their own guns. And they even made dummy runs on the Turks when they ran out of ammunition to get them off their horses and to keep their heads down and to protect Frank and Rutherford. So the rescue simply wouldn't have been possible without them, and Drummond made a comment in his deposition that when the BE-2 took off, they actually flew over the top of some of the Turks, and they were getting potted at point-blank range. Fortunately, the Turks probably didn't know how to hit a moving target. Now, both Ellis and Drummond rose to very high rank in the Air Force. Drummond actually became an RFC ace, and I'll speak about him a little bit later again. Now, so Frank's in Egypt in hospital trying to recover. He was actually quickly promoted to captain along with his VC award. He was intended to go to Europe with the AFC, but he was actually severely disabled. Even when he came back to Melbourne, he was still walking with two sticks. The heel was the problem. His thigh was getting better rapidly. He was evacuated to Australia for a so-called rest, and the ship that he came back on was called the Burara. Now, that actually was the ship that had been captured at the heads of Port Phillip Bay on the first day and the first shot of the war. I think it was called the Mainz in German. The German name of it was the Mainz. So, yes, that's circular facts. So he's coming back on the Burara, but the flying corps decided that he was too badly injured, and they decided to invalid him out. And there's a paper in Frank's file where he basically was taken out of the Australian Imperial Force and became an employee of the Central Flying School, which was not part of the AIF. So it was one day after the other, so he wasn't lacking employment, but it was a recognition that he was finished for operational flying. And he was also quite a social figure in Melbourne. He was famous for coming back with a VC. A lot of the people who won VCs in World War I were not repatriated. They die in action, or else at the very least they were stuck in France for quite a while. However, that situation didn't last of him sitting around the flying school, because there was a panic in 1918 in southern Australia, which involved UFOs. Now, I mean, it's a strange thing to say, but they were unidentified flying objects, and it was exactly the same as the sort of panic that occurred after World War II, and also in the 1970s when people started making movies about Close Encounters of the Third Kind and so on. There are lots of things in the sky that, if you're looking in the sky with worry and fear, look like a flying object. And here on the bottom of this slide is an example of an article of a spotting in Gippsland, where they saw an aeroplane in the district. Now, there were no aeroplanes. The only aeroplanes that belonged to the Australian Flying Corps at the Point Cook Flying School, and they simply weren't going in these areas. So the army became concerned, and the populace became very concerned because they were worried that they were enemy aeroplanes. And the reason they were worried was because of this ship over on the right-hand side, the Wolf. A German raider had returned to Europe very successfully, having preyed all over the Tasman Sea, the Pacific, and put mines down off the Australian coast, sunk some ships. and they had an aeroplane. And when they got back to Germany, they released all this publicity about having made a flight over Sydney Harbour. And so this was in all the Australian newspapers, everywhere, Gippsland included. And on the next page we can see, now you don't often see a clear picture of a UFO, but here you are, here's a clear picture. This is the little float plane that the Raider Wolf had, and it's called the Wolf Cub. And it certainly was a real flying object, but it was not flying over Sydney Harbour, as far as anyone can tell. That was pretty much propaganda, or they'd mistaken Suva for Sydney or something. It made flights elsewhere, but not over Sydney. And also it was long gone. It was a year before that it had been over Australia. So what were the unidentified flying objects? Largely they were astronomical phenomena, such as bright stars in the sky. And one candidate that was actually well known, it's one of the 10 brightest stars in the sky, is called Arkanar. It's an Arabic word, I believe. And Arkanar is a blue giant star, and it is spinning round very, very fast. And it's spinning so fast that it's like a Smartie. It's actually extended itself out in shape, so that it's got this bulging shape, and it's surrounded by a disk of shredded up planets, which is like exactly like a flying saucer. So I don't believe that any of the UFO sightings were using a good enough telescope to see this shape, but it's just a strange coincidence that Arkanar does in fact look like a UFO. But that was a very bright light on the horizon in the periods when this scare was going on, and very bright stars will often scintillate in the air currents, so that they go different colours. And if you're moving like a coachman would do, it appears to be moving along with you, so it's very frightening. And this has caused UFO scares through the last century. But anyway, Frank actually went to Yarram in Gippsland to do his patrolling and failed to find any UFOs, and then was brought home again. Now, the rest of his Air Force career, though, that I think the Australian Air Corps, which was inherited the Australian Flying Corps' really just a tiny number of people, and aircraft that were largely in boxes from the Imperial gift. Nonetheless, Frank was part of the flying school, and he basically became part of the post-war flying organisation. In 1921, the Royal Australian Air Force was formed, and now there were so many qualified people around who could have become Air Force officers, but the Air Force had a tiny, tiny employment base. And I know that there was agitation, including in the press, to make sure that Frank was accepted by the Australian Air Force. You can see in the photograph here, this is Frank, actually third on from the left, and they took some of the assembled Imperial gift aircraft and flew around the various states promoting what was called a peace loan. It was yet another fundraising like a war bond. And their tour was quite well publicised, but there were various accidents and things occurred, and overall it was there was a comedy of errors going on, I think. But anyway, Frank wasn't involved in the accidents in this case. When he was looking for UFOs, he did have quite a serious accident, but nobody was hurt. But that was flying in those days. It was all very slapdash. Now, the point to make about the RAAF in its early days was it was mainly a training organisation. That is, that their main job was to train civilian airmen. And Frank was perfectly suited to this. You know, he's basically a person with educational attributes, but he also has a Victoria Cross, and so he's a very good poster boy for the Air Force. He rose up through the RAF administration, and by 1930 he was commanding No. 1 Flight Training School. He finally finished his long interrupted university education, and a university degree in the Air Force was also very rare in those days, so he was a bit of an outstanding person, but apparently quite a mild personality, so not a head kicker. And in 1933 to 36 he was officer commanding Laverton, which was one of the RAF's major bases. But that was almost Frank's last gasp in Australia. He ended up spending most of the rest of his life in Britain. And the reason was that, to start off with, in the 1920s he'd gone to England to do training, and he'd ended up becoming an officer in the Air Ministry Directorate of Training. He came back to Australia, but then in 1937 he was sent to the Imperial Defence College, and from there he had a succession of jobs related to being the liaison officer for the Australian, you should call it government, I suppose, but he was basically the Air Force's man in Britain, in the Australia House. He became an Air Commodore in 1939, and then of course the war broke out, and he became one of the senior management of the Air Force's overseas organisation. Is our time expiring, Paul? So, now this post in England was a very difficult post, and Frank ended up being more or less pushed aside, but the government was trying to get rid of Dickie Williams. They sent him up there for a while, and later on Henry Wrigley was sent up, a very competent person who took over the whole operation. Williams went to Washington, and Frank was sent off by the Royal Air Force to become commander of the Aden area, which is in the Red Sea. It was a fairly important post, but it was on the periphery of Air Force operations.
And a long way away.
Yes, and also it was very bad for his health. It's an adverse environment, and he became seriously ill. Now, Frank was there until 1945. He came back actually during the war, but the Air Force had no jobs for its, on the whole, for its distinguished veterans, and there were other people in the RAF, in the Royal Australian Air Force, in particular George Jones, who was in charge of the thing, who didn't want to have highly qualified competitors floating around in the organisation, and along with many other excellent people, Frank was culled in 1946. He ended up, he by this stage made many contacts in the UK, and he ended up getting a job in the British Occupation Forces in Germany, where he was running their education operation. And this is not educating troops, it's educating the German civilians. And so Frank was restarting a shattered education system, a Nazi education system, and getting it up and running, and he apparently did a wonderful job. So in getting all these German children back in school again. And then he had a position on the British Coal Board as well. Now, I think that Frank always felt rather embittered, though, about Australia, and in particular what happened to him at the end of the war. Although this, of course, happened to many other senior officers as well. And he died in London in 1961, aged 67. And what happened to his Victoria Cross is it was donated to the RAF Museum in London. And it's still there today. They have an excellent web page on it. And this photograph is quite interesting because it's actually the reverse side of the VC. And the reverse shows the date that it was won, and also on the back of the bar is Frank's details and the fact he was in what was in those days called number 67 Australian Squadron RFC. And by the time he died, Frank had his VC, but also an Order of the Bath and a CBE. So he'd been quite warmly rewarded for his service.
By the British.
By the British, yeah. Now, I've got another slide here about Peter Drummond, one of the rescuers, or one of the air pilots who strafed the Turks during the VC rescue. He had a stellar career. He transferred to the RAF in 1918, and he became an ace with 8 victories with 111 Squadron. I think he was flying Bristol fighters, the same as 1 Squadron AFC was flying. Peter rose very high in the Permanent Royal Air Force. By 1941, he was the Deputy Air Officer Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East, so that was Deputy to Tedder. And he was a very, very competent person. He was knighted in 1943, and that was when the battle in Africa was successfully concluded. And he was appointed as an Air Marshal and became the Air Member for RAF training. It was quite an important position. He was a very close family friend of McNamara, and they actually lived in the same street in London. McNamara was, of course, away in Aden for a couple of these years, but apparently Peter was like a second father to Frank's children. Anyway, in March, 27th of March 1945, he was lost at sea in an air accident. You can see the plane down in the bottom right here. It's a transport plane, it's a modified Liberator bomber. And its name was Commando. It was quite a famous plane. It was Winston Churchill's personal transport at one stage. But Frank was more involved with this plane than he would have wanted because, firstly, Frank had to tell Drummond's wife that he'd been lost at sea. So Frank had to break the bad news to the family. It must have been shattering. But secondly, Frank himself, a month earlier, had seen this aircraft in Aden. And he'd seen the aircraft because the flight engineer had abandoned the aircraft. He'd refused to get back on it. And he said he'd rather be court-martialed than to fly in it again. And he called it a death trap. Now, Frank had it checked out by his engineering staff, and they said, look, the plane can make it back to London. But the thing was, Transport Command didn't overhaul it when it got back to London. They put it back on operations flying to the Azores, and it was going to go to Canada. And that's Peter Drummond. There were 7 VIPs and 7 crew on board, and it was lost without trace in the middle of the ocean on the way to the Azores. No radio message. It appears to be a catastrophic failure, like an explosion of some description or a sudden fire. And no wreckage was recovered, so they were never able to find out what happened to it. But the thing was, it was a death trap, and according to Frank's biographer, he did try to make sure that the poor guy who got court-martialed might have had his charges reversed. But and you can just imagine the impact of this on Frank. And look, I come away from this story thinking of Frank as generally a wonderful person, a nice guy, somebody who was very brave, and he might even have been shell-shocked when he was so brave. You know, it was a stupid thing to do, but it was really, really brave. And then he nearly died, and you know the peril was so high, and he was doing it for such an altruistic reason. So I feel really appreciative of Frank and his efforts, and I certainly think he deserves the Victoria Cross. Now, so what memories do we have of Frank back here in Australia? Well, he did a fair bit of his schooling in Shepparton, and they've named a park after him, and here it is, the Frank McNamara Park. It's got a slippery dip and some trees, and there's only one review on Facebook, and 3 stars. It's great. Poor Frank. I have corresponded with the Shepparton High School where Frank attended, and he was an educator all of his life, and I said, you know, could you name the high school after Frank? You know, it would make sense. Anyway, no reply was the answer. Not as far as the teachers are concerned. They wouldn't want to name it after somebody who was a horrible war hero. And in Little Rushworth, on the 20th of March 2017, that's 100 years after the VC incident, an amazing convoy of expensive vehicles arrived in Rushworth. Must have been the biggest action they'd seen for months, right? The Chief of Defence Force and the Chief of Air Force, and they unveiled this bronze sculpture in the median strip of the main street. Amazingly, George Jones, the Chief of the Air Staff, was also born in Rushworth, and he and Frank went to the same school, which is an amazing coincidence. By the way, George Jones apparently didn't like Frank very much because Frank was a Williams man. So apparently you were with Williams or against him. And anyway, of course, also we were up in Operation Okra at the time, so the Royal Australian Air Force named a small strip of sand McNamara VC compound, named in Frank's honour. So we really can't do enough for Frank, can we? So I say, lest we forget Frank. And that's the end of the presentation. So, how are we going for time, Paul?
There's no restriction.
Oh, no restriction. Well, okay. So, anybody? Any questions from in or out?
What actually happened to Frank after the war?
What happened to Frank after World War One?
After the Second World War.
Well, the Second World War, basically, he came back from Aden. He basically was the Royal Australian Air Force's representative in the RAF, so he was in an office somewhere. But our main job in those days was getting people back to Australia. He would have been involved in that, but nothing significant. And then the Air Force says, "Thank you very much, Frank, and see you later. We're pensioning you off."
And he went to the Cold War, was that?
Well, he used contacts to get a job in the British occupation of Germany.
Oh yeah, that was the,
And running their whole educational infrastructure, which is very good. And again, appealed to his talents. So, as I say, if World War I hadn't happened, then Frank would have ended up being a well-respected principal of some country high school. Yes, Paul, can I?
Was he stationed at Australia House in
Yes, he would have been.
38-39?
Yes, he would have been stationed at Australia House, and so I think there was only really one air officer, and there was a naval person. There would have been an army person as well.
I had access to Nancy Bird Norton's diary.
Yes.
And she was visiting Australia House in second half of 1938, and she mentioned a meeting in there.
Yes, well, he would have. He was responsible for meeting and greeting. You see,
yes.
all these VIPs coming through,
Yeah.
and also Dickie Williams was definitely using him as a spy when there was a move on to eject Williams, from the Air Force. Williams was using him as a spy to find out what the British had written in their confidential report and so on. So Frank had to run around, asking people what they were saying about Dickie Williams. And also, let me think, Doc Evatt, I think, after the war had broken out, Doc Evatt came up, mad, bee in his bonnet, he wanted Spitfires for Australia, and he'd been apparently hitting Frank over the head to get the Spitfires, nothing had been happening, and Doc Evatt goes to see Churchill and thumps the table and gets Spitfires. Yeah. And poor Frank thought this was an enormous blow to his career. He thought that the Labor politicians had it in for him. Anyway,
James, Mark Lax, can I?
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
A couple of things. When Frank was in hospital recovering from his World War I VC incident, the reason he had a bad foot was because the medical staff put hot water bottles around it.
Yes.
And he was he's on painkillers, so he couldn't feel the fact that it was like a slow burn. It wasn't like a boiling water. If you leave a hot water bottle on your leg for 2 hours and it's quite hot, it will do a lot of damage to the nerves and the muscles. So that's what happened there.
It is. I was going to say, Mark, in the biography of Frank, they actually have a picture, and it's a horrific wound.
Yeah, it is. It's like an ulcer.
Yes, yes.
The other thing, a couple of other things. There was a lot of rumours going around in the squadron after that incident that Rutherford was actually trying to surrender because of those number of crashes he had. Now, that was just it's in a lot of the diaries of a lot of the airmen at the time, so I make no comment on that, but it's just an interesting view. And if he did have PTSD, it might have had some sort of an influence in that.
No, I agree, yes. We can't really know, but I think poor Rutherford, he's an unfortunate chap. I think he's just jinxed, actually.
Yeah, and the other thing is, it's my recollection that McNamara bequeathed his VC to the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, which is where it is.
Yes.
And I actually spoke to the RAF historian about this, and he said, yes, it was bequeathed in his will that it was never to come back to Australia regardless of what the circumstances. Yeah, so it's one of the ones the War Memorial will not get access to because of the bequest. And the reason is because at the end of the war, the Australian government chose to savagely cull all the service heads. And I'm just looking at my Air Force list here that Jones survived because he was Chief of the Air Force. But of all the Air Commodores, only Macaulay and Sherger survived out of about 15.
Yes.
The rest, including McNamara, were retired.
Well, Jones was
McNamara felt that he was treated very unjustly, and he was very bitter to the end of his days about the way he thought he was treated by the Australian government, and indeed Jones.
Yes.
So that was one of the reasons that the VCs was not coming back to Australia.
Now, Jones was the one doing the culling, of course, and do you know the story about the appointment of Jones in the first place? Apparently the incoming Labor government, this is in 1941 I think, misread the seniority list. And Jones got up, despite everyone not expecting that to have happened. And but once he was in position, it's worth hanging on to.
Yeah, they were looking to replace
there was a British chap.
the British Army,
yeah.
I think his name, who by the way was also the opposite of Williams in the Middle East. I think his name. Anyway, the cabinet was meeting to discuss who would be promoted, and they went through the list, and Williams and Goble were struck off straight away.
Yes.
Bostock had too many liberal leanings, and he was struck off. And basically, they got down to the bottom of the list when they said, "Well, this is guy Jones. Who knows Jones?" And no one put their hand up, so they said, "Right, he's the one." And he lasted for 10 years in the job.
Yes, yes. Well, apparently, I think definitely had a good record in World War One, and also his administrative skills must have been okay, because I think we ended up with the 4th largest air force in the world at the end of World War Two. So.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, that letter that I gave you.
Yep.
Do you know where I found it? It's in the museum, one of the cabinets in the Caboolture End Museum. How it got there? I have no idea.
Wow.
But I was looking at it, as soon as I saw it, I knew who it was, so I took a picture of it, because I knew these guys didn't know what it was.
Well, actually, Mark, thank you again for sending it to me for one thing, but secondly, did you notice the way that he had to actually give his mother the propaganda line that he'd been hit by anti-aircraft? He wasn't allowed to say that it was his own shell that had blown up.
Yeah. Yes.
There are so many sort of untold bits to this story. If you read his Australian Dictionary of Biography entry today online, it'll say that Rutherford was shot down, which he wasn't, his engine stopped, right, so a cock up. That Frank had an AA hit, which he didn't, it was our own shell blew up in his face. So, and then nobody mentions I think the biography may mention his nearly being killed by our medical treatment, but there's a lot of sort of unedifying parts to this story, which is why what people hear about it is such a vague interpretation usually.
Never let a good story get involved with the facts.
Exactly.
And destroyed by the facts.
So Mark, I'll ask Paul, what Paul, can
I have two
questions? Yes?
questions. At least 4 Victoria Cross winners were emblazoned on RAAF training aircraft, including McNamara about 2 years ago. Even though he wasn't a RAF pilot at the stage, AFC.
Yeah.
And I think Mark made comment about that short article I wrote. But more importantly, you showed a photograph of Ross Smith.
Yes.
Now, that photograph appears in Aces and
Kings.
Kings.
Yes.
And the author, Sutherland, uses the nickname Hadji for Ross Smith.
Yes.
And in one of the chapters, he describes that photograph was taken following Ross Smith returning from an unauthorised sortie in which he landed at an enemy airfield near Damascus, and he and his observer destroyed 3 German aircraft, a hangar, and damaged another aircraft before escaping. Mark, do you know that story?
I'd have to, a long time back. Yeah, I'm not sure if it was true or not that way.
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and look at it.
It's certainly in the iconography, but whether it really happened or not, as you say.
So it's a furphy story, maybe.
Well, look, the actual wound that he had was aerial combat, right? So it wasn't on the ground. So I'm sorry, Paul, I can't say with my knowledge. But Mulcanton again has written an excellent Ross Smith biography, and I would say that would be the best place to look.
Yeah, there's a couple of biographies of Ross Smith.
Yeah.
One written about 25, 30 years ago. Longer. Yep.
Second question, Paul? Ooh.
Was it because of the chain of command within the RFC easier to progress a recommendation for an Australian Victoria Cross to a flyer than would have been the case on the Western Front?
Well, look, I've done a bit of research into the VCs awarded in the air at the same time, in like March 1917. There was a few, and VCs, I mean, it's the highest award, but there's also a very great degree of sort of politics and serendipity and involved in these things. There need to be witnesses for a start. You know, a lot of very valorous acts probably there are no witnesses to them. So it's a bit of a lottery as to who gets the VC and who doesn't. The other people who won VCs at a similar time were often involved in rescues. Like one guy got a VC just for getting a plane back with a wounded observer in it. You know, so, but I think the standard of the act you had to perform went up and up over time. Some people got VCs for shooting down large numbers of planes. So I think Frank's act was quite definitely outstanding valour. You know, he was taking on a huge risk, and as I say, I suspect he was knocked stupid by the hit. That it was really a very unwise thing for him to do, but he got away with it. So. But anyway, look, I think the fact that he was Australian, it was just the RFC organisation who promoted the VC. I think everyone was impressed with the act. There were 3 different witnesses, each with independent statements, and then also there was a 4th recommendation from the guy who was commanding the entire RFC organisation in the Middle East. But then I think those things then went to a further committee further up for the award of VCs, and it all depends on what sort of week they were having, I guess. You know, how much competition there was. Anyway, good on Frank for getting it, and it was, there were no doubt so many acts of bravery performed by Australians either in the British flying services or in the Australian Flying Corps, which have been noted in, you know, rewarded in many ways, but not with the VC.
I suppose that what you're saying about the criteria for being awarded a VC, the one that runs against that is of course Bishop.
Yes.
No witnesses.
No, well, yeah, exactly. But
the Germans didn't seem to notice what he'd done.
But I think they probably did a good propaganda thing in the British papers at the time.
They needed to boost the morale of the RFC.
Yep. So, yes, bloody April for some. Yes.
Well, it was, there's the other one, Gerard.
Yes.
The VC in Italy. He was the last RFC VC, and I think that they needed one on the Italian front.
Yes, right, so political.
So he'd been shot down in glorious circumstances, taken a few Austrians with him, awarded the VC, and then they get the letter saying, I'm a prisoner of war.
Yes, so I imagine you
can you hear me, James?
Yes? Gordon?
Sorry, can you hear me,
yes,
James?
Yes, can certainly hear you. Yes, Gordon, hello.
G'day, how you going?
Great, thank you.
A couple of things. Just about you were talking about the VC winners out, sort of a real lottery.
Yeah.
That happened with a lot of things, DFCs as well, and everything like that. And, you know, some people got DFCs. I'm thinking of 78 Squadron in the Second World War. They awarded DFC to a person in the squadron. He was the CO, of course. And, you know, we don't know why he got it, essentially. And his leadership skills were open to question, including leading the squadron the opposite direction he should have been until one of the flight commanders called up. And yet someone else, like Flying Officer Gordon White, who was a the top scorer in the last big combat of the Second World War, Big Do. He shot down 3 aircraft, and Curly Bryden tried on 2 separate occasions to get him to DFC, and nothing came to him.
Yes, yeah.
You know, you just wonder how they allocated.
Look, I think there's endless stories like that, Gordon, yeah.
There is, you're right. And look, thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Jordan.
Going right back to the beginning, you mentioned about how McNamara was in Brighton Rifles.
Yes.
So also was Arthur Cobby.
Oh.
Were they at the same time?
Look, I'm guessing so. It would have just been a reserve unit, but they would have drilled together. Yeah, they would have drilled together. They would have been a similar age.
Yeah, because both Victorians.
Yeah, so
I
I can well imagine it would have been just one drill hall or scout hall somewhere, and they would have been basically all in together, yes.
Yeah. Also, just talking about the UFOs for a minute, out Yarra Way or Gippsland Way, there's a big plaque to Frank McNamara out there.
Oh, right.
And there's a fair bit of information, and there's actually even a model on a stand, I think it's a 1-to-1 scale model done by the local TAFE of the FE-2B that McNamara flew.
Wonderful. And crashed.
And
well, I think he chose Yarram because it had basically good flying conditions, and it's a lovely town. I quite liked it when I've been there. So
yes, well, I quite liked it when we were there.
Yeah.
But they also talked about going to. He went up also to Twofold Bay at Eden.
I think that was a separate aircraft. The flying school sent 2 aircraft, and I think McNamara went south, and I think the Twofold Bay one was a different aircraft, different crew.
Well, McNamara, when he was out at Yarram, requested a second aircraft, according to the information out at Yarram.
Yeah, right.
And they sent out another one, which was a Morris Farman short haul aircraft, and it was piloted by Lieutenant J. Mardule, and there was an air cadet, J. Patterson, was the observer.
Right.
And they apparently operated out of Yarram too for a little while. But they were looking for what we know now as the Wolf.
Yes, but the Wolf was already gone. That was the thing, yeah.
Yes. But the people were talking about it. They were talking about the UFOs in the sky. They were talking about there was this coastal thing that's sinking ships off it, and they wanted something done.
Yes.
So I thought that's what. Well, according to the information out of Yarram, that's why they say McNamara was sent out.
I've had actually some correspondence with a guy who's done an excellent history of all the flights that McNamara did.
Oh, really?
Yes. Which, by the way, I'll share with you. But
yes, do that.
So they were spooked by all sorts of things, but people were hearing all sorts of noises and hearing engines. They were looking at lights in the sky. They were certainly looking at shadows out to sea. And the mines that the Wolf dropped did indeed blow up Australian ships. So, and they were also capturing ships. And then the testimonials were coming back when the Wolf got back to Europe. All of this was propaganda, A-grade propaganda. So and it was in all the Australian papers, even down in Yarram.
That's right. That's right. And
I think also even the Australian authorities weren't handling the whole thing well. Instead of hosing it down, they sort of panicked,
Yes. It's worthwhile going out there because they've got a photo out there of Frank McNamara in the cockpit of the FE-2B at Yarram.
Yes. Look, I think it was a chance for Frank to restore his operational flying career. Because if you think about it, that in Australia we would have had next to no one with any, for example, night flying experience. Certainly nobody with any operational experience, and he had a VC. So it was UFO was a golden opportunity for Frank to get back into operational flying. So it did get him back into the mainstream of the Air Force again.
It did indeed. Yeah. Fascinating stuff. And thank you also that information after the war. I didn't realise that McNamara, particularly after the Second World War, was such a political pawn like the rest of them.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, it doesn't reflect well on the country, but that's what happened. There you go. Yeah.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah. And as we say, that the disposition of the VC says it all. You know, as far as Frank was concerned.
Yes. Yes, doesn't it?
Yeah. Righty-ho, well thanks Gordon. Anybody else got another question?
Yeah. Just an observation, just going for a tangent, but the Australian government being worried, I think there was a fear that there could be another raid.
Yes, yes.
And it's one of the reasons, excuse me, the internment camp and jail at South West Rocks was closed.
Oh, yeah, right. Signalling
from there down to, no, they moved down to Holsworthy.
Yeah.
Because there was a fear that a German raider would turn up and rescue them.
Right, well.
The Germans from...
Yes, I imagine all of these things were preying on the minds of the authorities in Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're out there somewhere. Well,
it's just one of those things where a UFO scare starts, or an unidentified floating object scare starts. Once it's going, people all subscribe to it, and the military authorities have got no other way of gathering information other than what's in the paper, so they're panicking as well. And their solution is to send Frank McNamara, VC, and his plane down to have a look. And another one to Twofold Bay.
and if, you probably know, there's a mine from the Wolf on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland.
Oh, excellent. I didn't know that. Right.
Yeah. Tewantin, I think it is.
Okay.
It had drifted ashore in about 1920. So it spent about 3 years slowly drifting up the east coast.
So we got Des, we got Tewantin on our travel list. We got Yarram, the full scale recreation of an FE2B.
Apart from that.
Yeah. Des, shall I hand back to you?
I think Gareth's going to say something.
Oh, okay.
Oh, just to thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Very good. I'm sure we all learned something. It's amazing what information is out there.
Oh, yes.
Suddenly we come across it.
Excellent job. As inaccurate as it may be. Okay, Des, I'll leave it over to you.
Thank you very, very much. Very distinguished.